Good morning. It is what time? 8:23 a.m. on Monday, October 26th. I am Christiana Ellis, and I've been up for a little bit, put my contact lenses in, as you can see. This is 5 more minutes. So, I fell down a internet rabbit hole already this morning because apparently one of the new pseudoscience conspiracy theories going around is that the only reason that there's all these new COVID cases now is because supposedly the PCR tests used to detect them have very high false positive rates. And so that is being used by some of these people to justify that, like, somehow the whole thing is fake, that the testing is only to make money, that lockdowns shouldn't happen. And, like, I'm going to say right up front, like, I am not an epidemiologist. I am not an expert. I've not, I'm not the source that you should use to go to for this sort of information. But what I would suggest is that if you see some of that type of stuff, look up actual reputable sources as opposed to the guy on the internet, even if they say they're an MD or have a blue check on Twitter. Because some of, like, I'm not an expert, but some of what I've seen them saying is just obviously wrong. Like, some of them are saying really extreme things like, oh, it has a 94% false positive rate, which is just hooey. It's not true. It's really not. Like, the whole point of that type of test is that it is detecting the specific RNA sequences of that virus. It is very specific, and generally speaking, any false positive rate you would ever get with that test is attributed to sample contamination and not because the test is bad. So there's that to start. Also, just the idea that there might be some reasonable discussions about what is the best kind of test. What kinds of testing should we be doing? What does it mean when you get a specific type of test result? Like, there can be lots of reasonable discussion and debates to be had about all of that. And that's where my lack of expertise is going to make me not the person that you should use as a primary source on this sort of information, but neither should you be getting it from some guy on Twitter. But the whole, like, there could be reasonable questions about, like, is this PCR test the one that we should be giving to everybody? Because it's also true that as a general rule, like, the way it's most commonly used is that you're giving it to someone who is already suspected to be sick. And so there's a built-in assumption that, if you get a test result, then that's probably what it is. But some of the arguments being made are the idea that, like, oh, if you have to, like, part of the way the test works is that it does, like, this is an extreme oversimplification. It does sort of a scan, and if it doesn't see any of the RNA virus, it does another scan, and it keeps scanning because the thing is, it's looking for individual molecules in a sample, and it would be easy to miss them, right? Especially if there's not a ton of them there. And so generally speaking, one of the numbers that you can look at with a test like that is how many times does it have to scan before it finds a molecule. And so as a very loose correlation, you can say, well, if it doesn't have to scan very many times, there's probably a lot, right? Because just statistically, if it doesn't have to keep looking for very long, there's probably a lot of it there. Whereas if it has to keep going over and over and over and over and over, there's not as much there. And so what that means is that you could, if you have your test set to say scan 35 times, before it finds any, and if it finds any within 35 times, you call that a positive. If it doesn't, then that's a negative. But some of the people making these arguments are using that to justify that, like, oh, well, we're calling someone positive even if it's a very low amount because it only detected it after so many scans, which means that they're probably not contagious anymore because they're already getting over it. And it's like, well, there's a lot of supposes in there, but also, like, if someone had it at all, maybe they aren't still contagious, but if they didn't know they had it before, they should probably talk to people they were in contact with, right? Because those people might still be contagious. Like, that's the whole point of contact tracing and all of that stuff. I'm not an expert in these things. But when I started seeing some of the people talking about, oh, the PCR test has a 90% false positive rate, I was like, So I spent a little bit of time looking it up, and the answer was what I thought, which is it's looking for the specific RNA of just this virus. It does not detect other viruses. It does not detect the flu virus. If you test positive for it, it is almost certain that you actually have it, or did have it at least. In fact, the false negative rate is much higher than the false positive rate for a test like that. And so that is part of why they set it to test, like to scan a lot of times before indicating that it would be negative, because you're trying to, the risk in a pandemic like this of a false negative is higher than a false positive. Because what's the risk of a false positive is that you ask someone to quarantine themselves for a while when they maybe didn't need to, which is not nothing, right? Like, if that could be very inconvenient for someone, it could be scared. Like, it's not nothing, but also part of the way you work with that is you take another test, right? Like, if you get a false positive and then you take it again and it's this time it's the same result, the odds of it being two false positives in a row, lower, right? But if it's, get a positive test and you take another one and it's still positive, that's a better, you probably do have it. Whereas the risk of a false negative is that you think you're fine, especially when we're thinking this is an illness that, can potentially be very contagious even when you don't know you have anything. You get a false negative and you go around and continue all your normal activity, and now you've infected all of your family members, and then who knows how many they infect. That's why a false negative is a bigger risk than a false positive. I'm not an expert in these things, but I have studied them some. So, like, I'm not telling you to trust me, but if you see some of that sort of talk going around, I would urge you to do your own research with reputable sources of actual epidemiologists and not just some guy. Like, and also don't conflate the idea that there could be real discussions about what is the best way to test and the people who say PCR testing bad, therefore pandemic isn't real, right? Those people should be ignored, or at the very least fact checked. And because this is such a it's such a specialized thing that it requires a lot of information that, the average person doesn't have, because why would they normally? It can get confusing. So if someone is saying things like the pandemic isn't real, you can kind of say, well, there's 300,000 more people than usual have died this year in the United States alone. Something's happening, right? And it's not just the lockdown. So I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.